Okay. Well, that was a great panel this morning. I thought it was really excellent. And because of that, I've actually never shown a video in a presentation, but I had this video that shows a autonomous shared transit vehicle. And it's only 1 minute, so I'm going to try and show it to you because I think this is really an example of the kind of pilot you could get going here.
Is that a thing? I'm just waiting here. There should be someone called Ollie coming to pick me up. Ollie?
Hello, James.
Who's that?
It's me, Ollie. Please have a seat.
Right. Where's the driver?
I'm the world's first cognitive, self-driving shuttle. And I'm electric. I'm the future of travel.
Is this your only voice? Can you do any other voices? Can you do a Tennessee accent?
Hey, y'all. Who wants grits?
I mean, honestly, I don't always trust my driving. Why would I trust a computer?
Because I don't drink, text, or get tired.
So how do you flirt with other buses if you don't text?
Ha, ha, ha.
Is that your laugh? Thanks so much, Ollie. Thank you.
Okay. So that's it. That's the shared future, and I don't know how to get out of this. Okay. And so I am going to talk about pilot projects, different ideas about shared mobility, and I'm going to start with the Shared Use Mobility Center. We're based in Chicago. We're a nonprofit. We also have an office in Los Angeles, and we've only been around less than 3 years. And we formed after the sale of iGo Car Sharing, which was nonprofit car sharing similar to city car share out here. And the board decided to allocate some of the funds from the sale of iGo to creating an organization that would continue the same mission, which is to make it possible to live well without having to own your own car by creating a multimodal transportation system that works for all. So what we've been focusing on is exactly the topic that you're looking at today, which is really like, how do we make this stuff work? You know, so we do a lot of work connecting transit agencies, public agencies with the private sector, with community organizations to figure out how it can work. And we're involved in a lot of research as well to look at the impacts of these modes. And we've been creating tools for cities to use, providing technical assistance when the pilots get underway, and holding a lot of workshops, webinars, conferences, things like that. And some of the stuff kind of coming up, which I think will be relevant this year, is we're involved in looking at all the private transit providers out there. So all these different van pools and employer shuttles and all across the country, dollar vans, all sorts of things, and trying to really get a sense. There's actually hasn't been a like a typology of all of these services put together for like 25 years. And so we're looking at what's out there and where the opportunities are for partnerships. We're also just completing a study looking at European practices around shared mobility. Very interesting, a lot of stuff going on. We're working with the Federal Transit Administration on assisting 11 cities around the country who've all formed different partnerships between public transit agencies, private providers, and they're actually trying to do things a little differently and not follow the regular regulatory process at FTA and experiment with new programs. We're involved in Los Angeles and also in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, working with them on a mobility action plan. We're working on mobility hubs and all these things. So I'll show you a little bit of what that's all about. This is from our toolkit that we have, and this is a benefits calculator. And so what it does is you put how many cars you want to get rid of or reduce the use of for reducing congestion, and then it gives you some goals that you can set in terms of increasing transit, bike sharing, ride sharing, all the shared modes, and kind of what the impacts would be. And we're using this calculator when we're working with cities. So we really, one of the steps that we think is very important is to in fact set goals and have a vision of where you're going. And in Los Angeles County, so not just the city of Los Angeles, but also a number of smaller communities throughout the county have together set this goal of 100,000 cars off the road in 5 years, and then have embarked on a plan, and we're working with them on implementing it. And in the Twin Cities, we're working on a similar plan. They haven't set the goal of exactly how many cars yet, but they're also increasing all their shared modes. So what are we talking about with shared modes? This is a shared mobility typology. And you'll notice that public transit is actually at the top. So we see that as key to making this work, that public transit is the backbone of any system. So then to that we add bike sharing, car sharing, ride hailing, ride splitting, ride sharing, carpooling, microtransit, shuttles, taxis. And at the bottom of the list, we put mobility hubs as the kind of physical place that can bring together all these shared modes. And really what we've learned from all our work is that it's all of these modes together and providing a lot of options that can combine in a seamless way that is really going to be the most beneficial. If we can create a lot of options that work, then people can choose between them and find the appropriate mode. So we've been tracking shared mobility around the country, and of course, as you know, here in the Bay Area, where it's really the heart of a lot of this and the leader, but there are a lot of companies engaged. And I think the biggest thing, and it got mentioned a little bit in the last panel, is that of course, Google's involved in Uber and Lyft, but there's also all the car manufacturers now are starting to have stakes in shared mobility. So, when Ford and GM and Toyota and BMW and Daimler's whole range of services. So all of these manufacturers are involved, and what we're seeing is this blending between car sharing, ride sharing, autonomous vehicles, electric. It's all sort of, the borders are getting fuzzy between them. And so it's definitely a lot of investment is there, and it's continuing to evolve. And of course, you have lots of it here, and Maven is owned by GM, Ford is operating the bicycles, so you've got all kinds of things going on as examples. So why is it important in Marin County? Because shared mobility can reduce reliance on private autos. It can fill in the gaps in transit, particularly on weekends and nights. It can provide that first last mile connection, and it can be implemented relatively quickly, and it can encourage sustainable and walkable communities. So when we talk about all these different transportation options, we're actually talking about solving some really major issues, because we're talking about climate change, health, poverty. These are big topics that can be addressed with, by growing these systems and by experimenting and finding out what can work. And we completed a study for the Transportation Research Board this past year, and we did a survey of shared mobility users in 7 different cities, and we were also able to analyze Uber data and look at and transit data. And the biggest finding that, well, there are 2 things that are kind of major. One is that people who use 3 or more modes, 3 modes plus transit, they actually own 1 car less than other people. So that only use transit. And and it's kind of obvious in a way, but and it's not like the end-all study, it's a survey, and that's what people reported. But the important part of this is that if you do provide lots of different options and it can work, you live in a neighborhood where you actually have access to all these things and they can get you to where you need to go, well then it can make it possible to live well without having to own as many cars. And so it might be that somebody's going from 3 to 2 or 2 to 1 or 1 to 0. It could be any version of that, but it can work. Then the other thing that we saw in our study was that for the most part, and this is not totally true in all circumstances, but for the most part, the transportation networking companies and the other shared modes are complementary to public transit. What we saw was that most of the trips occur nights, weekends, along very heavily traveled routes. So they're not as, they're adding to the transit system essentially. But what we also saw was that transit is most competitive when it is in its own right of way with frequent service. So clearly, if the transit system cannot get you to where you need to go quickly and efficiently, then people are thinking about different alternatives, and it can be that there's a variety of shared modes that have to be thought about for different types of trips. So we have a toolkit. Part of our toolkit includes a policy database that has all kinds of policies, and I just listed here some policies that I think might be relevant in this county, and it's about street space requirements, making these different modes very easily accessible and apparent. It's about requirements for builders, developers in terms of making shared mobility, car sharing, bike sharing available in buildings, about how the parking requirements are set has a big impact, of course, on the use of these systems. Procurement, that got mentioned this morning, having things that are very flexible and open-ended, and in terms of working with the private sector, that's what we've seen is a way to try to find some common ground and get things implemented more quickly. And certainly providing infrastructure, especially when we're talking about bike sharing, having good, safe infrastructure can make a big difference in the uptake and utilization that's going to occur. Then I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is like a new slide from our study that hasn't come out yet. But what it shows is that Uber and Lyft, most of the rides, we're looking at their traffic patterns in 5 cities, and they're very short trips. They're either to the airport or they're very short. And so it's just interesting. It's just an example of the filling in the gaps. This is in the Chicago area. So these are some examples of the different kinds of programs. First, last mile, which we've has been mentioned. Multimodal app payment integration. This is another big thing going on all over the place, and some in the Bay Area, of course. But it's part of making a seamless system that makes it easy for people to transfer between modes. Carpooling, ride sharing, this is, of course has been around forever, carpooling, but now with the electronic versions of this where you're not in the same carpool with the same people for every ride necessarily, you're just able to pair up, and of course the program here in the Bay Area where you're able to have priority parking at some BART stations, those types of things. Incentivizing people to travel in carpools is a really interesting process. Demand response, micro-transit, van pools, ride splitting, that was talked about this morning. These services where they're using algorithms to actually change the route depending on who wants to get a ride in the service, is that kind of flexibility can be tremendous and very interesting and provide a quick service. So the way some of these services work, you make a reservation like right before you want to go, and you have your destination, and so you can actually, then the route can be shaped based on who wants to go at a particular time. So in terms of opportunities here, microtransit, these kinds of smaller vehicles using algorithms to improve the service, or just quick vans, really extending the reach of fixed route transit, going from the ferry terminal to all different locations, going, different distances in the corridor, lower density areas, and augmenting service. And there are a lot of examples from other cities where this is being tried. The other big thing we're seeing are a lot of innovative services for seniors. A lot of all the shared mobility kind of got started with ideas about a lot of millennials, but it also makes a lot of sense across age groups. And there are a lot of experiments going on with door-to-door service in a variety of places that is particularly targeting seniors. And in fact, maybe, I don't know if that'll get mentioned when Lyft talks about their concierge service and their program in Centennial, and I think the program that's started or about to start here in Marin County. And then just to let you know, there are a lot of other companies also that have, now I think Lyft Hero is actually no longer around, but Silver Ride, GoGo Grandparent, these are services that are using similar technology to Uber and Lyft, but the drivers are specifically people who can handle paratransit type needs, somebody with a walker, somebody who needs a little assistance to get to the door. And so these are other ways that these services are getting adopted or adapted. Then this is an example of a mobility hub, which they're transit hubs obviously, but a mobility hub is kind of taking it one step further. It's really the place to learn about all these services, and it involves a concierge as well as a place to access a lot of things. So finally, to wrap this up, these are some of our recommendations for the county to think about making mobility the goal. And when you look at your metrics for how you're measuring success, it has to be about, can people get where they need to go? Not, is this bus full, or how many, how big is it? Incentivize the scale and equity of the services. That really is the role that government can play require data sharing to learn and understand where people are going and what the needs are, pilot innovative projects, develop partnerships, be bold, be flexible, and really, when it comes down to it, involves being very persistent. Thank you.